I want to move on and develop our discussion a little bit more. This is the definition of politics that we sort of settled on. Actually, I introduced you to 3 definitions of politics in the class session last Friday. And I told you that the Laswell definition is easy to remember, the Easton definition is easy to remember, but they kind of are wanting or lacking in the sense that we need explanation of the definition. And this definition, I don't think, is by a perfect definition by any stretch of the imagination, but it does say some things explicitly that you can only infer from the Laswell and Easton's definition. And that's the business about politics being a competitive process, because the things that we value in society, that members of society value, are scarce. They're not abundant. They're not infinite. Right? They're scarce. That means people are in conflict over those scarce resources. And so the society has to have some process for determining who gets them, when they get them, and how they get them, how to allocate those scarce resources. And as a result of how the society allocates those scarce resources, it says something about the priorities that the society has. And so we talked about those ideas a little bit last time. The idea that there are relative winners and losers, all of that we can sort of glean from just that definition of politics, right? Which I think gets us a pretty good start, right? And then I gave you a definition of government as well. I don't have that handy. I'm not going to try to pull that up. It's the structured arrangements in a society that produces decisions resolving conflicts over scarce resources. And the deliberate attempt by defining government in that fashion is to help you sort of draw the connection between politics and government. Your intuition tells you that there's a connection between politics and government. You know what happens in Washington in the government is political in its nature. That's not a shock to anybody in here. Even if you think you don't really know anything about politics, even if you think you don't have much understanding of what happens in our government, you at least know that what happens is political. Right? So we know that there's that connection between politics and government. But I cautioned you last time that politics is really a broader concept. Right? The kind of activities, the kinds of behaviors that occur in government institutions are political, but there are political behaviors and activities that occur in non-governmental institutions as well. Right? And we'll talk about some of those this semester. I hinted in the last class meeting about, we have a topic, for example, this semester on political parties. That's not government. We have a topic on interest groups. That's not government. Okay? We have a number of topics like that. Okay? In fact, specifically our treatment of government in this class, our examination of government institutions, doesn't really occur until the very end of the semester, when we have topics on Congress as an institution, and the presidency as an institution, and the courts and bureaucracies. Okay? Down around week 11 or 12, something like that, I think. And so most of this class is really designed to deal with the aspects of the American political system that are external to government. Okay? Anyway, so I was hoping with that definition of government we would kind of see the connection between politics and government. Okay? And I sort of left you with the question last time, why do people in at least American political society view government as legitimate? Why do people pay their taxes? Why do people obey the speed limit or whatever other regulations governments impose and the United States governments impose on them? And we were sort of talking about the idea that, well, if we don't, we'll be punished. And then I said, well, that just sort of shifts the burden, because the next question that I want to pose to you is, well, why do you accept the punishment? Why do you think that government has the authority to punish you? And really, I think the simple, just so we can move on to new stuff, I think the simple answer to that is, whether we've thought it through very carefully or not, we sort of have grown up being trained up to believe that whatever authority government has comes from us in the first place. We might not like how much government taxes us. We might not like how much government regulates us, or the specific instance of the regulation in this instance or that instance. But ultimately, we kind of have this idea that the authority of government comes from us. It's embodied in those 3 little words that open the preamble of the Constitution, right? We the people. Exactly. There you go. We the people of the United States. in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense. For all these purposes that we have, we do ordain and establish this government and give the government this authority to make these kinds of binding decisions in our lives. There are very few people, as much as they might complain, very few people in American society, as much as they might complain about paying taxes or how much government regulates them, that really fundamentally question the authority of government to govern over them. If, they're part of some militia or something out in some remote area of North Dakota or Utah or someplace like that, maybe so, but most people aren't that sort of that wacko. Okay, so let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about what I like to refer to as the politics of ideas. We know that politics is a competitive process, and it has to do with the allocation of scarce resources. I want to build on that some by talking a little bit about the politics of ideas. And I want to define the politics of ideas as the process whereby ideas or sets of ideas compete with one another to achieve prominence in a society. The politics of ideas is the process whereby ideas or sets of ideas compete with one another in order to achieve prominence in a society. Governmental institutions and processes, broad public policy agendas, specific policies and programs then are subsequently based on the idea or the ideas that have come to predominate. So you have all these different ideas out there, or sets of ideas out there that are in competition with one another. Right? And ultimately, maybe as a result of a specific process, like say an election, one set of ideas comes to a position of prominence. If there's a set of ideas, for example, that we could label Trumpism, imagine that there's some set of ideas out there that we can label Trumpism. Then Trump, the person, Donald Trump, is elected president. Would we not expect for the president's policy agenda to reflect the ideas of Trumpism? And there would be some effort, whether it's sort of broad philosophical ideas or specific ideas, like say broad ideas like deregulation, or even specific ideas like building a border wall. Wouldn't we expect, to the extent that that has come to a position of prominence, that the president in his official capacity would attempt to move a policy agenda based on those ideas? Okay? Sure, that makes sense, right? So initially here, we understand that there's all these ideas out there in the political arena that are competing with one another, and somehow a set of ideas or even specific ideas come to a position of prominence, and that has consequences in terms of what government actually does. Okay? Sometimes in the politics of ideas, the idea or the set of ideas are relatively short-lived. Consider as an example prohibition in the early part of the 20th century, about 100 years ago. You had, in a relatively short period of time, an idea come. Now, it had deeper roots. Some of you may know that the prohibition of transport and sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States actually had its origins back in the 19th century during the women's temperance movement, right? But ultimately, this constitutional amendment effort comes along in the early part of the 20th century. The Constitution is amended to prohibit the sale and transport of alcoholic beverages in the United States. But just a few years later, that idea has faded from prominence. In fact, the repeal comes very quickly in a second or subsequent constitutional amendment. So that happens sometimes. Sometimes an idea comes to a position of prominence, and then almost as quickly, it would seem, it sort of fades away. Other ideas have greater permanence. Consider the idea of Republican form of government. Republican Republican form of government rose to prominence during a period of Western history that we're going to talk in some detail about in just a couple of class meetings down the road. It's the period that the historians refer to as the Age of Enlightenment, which is primarily the 18th century, the 1700s. So again, we'll talk about that in a lot more detail because it's very important for us. During the Age of Enlightenment, political thinkers, political philosophers, people who espouse political ideas began to argue that Republican government was preferable to the form of government that Westerners had been accustomed to for a couple of millennia up to that point. The other major form of government in the world historically, monarchy. Europeans, for example, had lived up until that time in monarchical systems with a king or a queen. But beginning the Age of Enlightenment, philosophers began reflecting, maybe there's a better way to structure and organize government rather than on the basis of having a hereditary monarch. And of course, the Americans in 1776 were the first to establish, when they declared their independence from Britain and established the United States, were the first modern nation to establish a permanent republican form of government. But through the 19th century, the idea of republicanism caught fire, right? And by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, by the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, most of the European nation states, and certainly all of the countries of North and South America, of the Americas, and many of the countries of Asia, and really all around the world, had transformed from monarchical arrangements to republican systems. So we've been sort of living in a world in the 20th century and now into the 21st century that is quite well entrenched in the idea of republicanism. Not all republican governments look exactly the same or operate the same. In fact, there can be quite significant differences. But most countries in the world today do not have a king or a queen.
Except like as a figurehead, I suppose?
Well, if we wanted to get into some discussion, we can talk about the fact that there are different types of monarchies, right? Maybe one broad distinction that we can make would be between what we might call a genuine monarchy, like, say, Saudi Arabia, where the king, the royal family generally really is the sovereign. That word sovereign means the ultimate source of political authority. Okay? So Saudi Arabia would be an example. I'm certainly not an expert on Saudi Arabia, but I think I understand enough to know that in Saudi Arabia, the king is the sovereign. Okay? And there are some implications there for democracy or lack thereof of democracy in Saudi Arabia and rights of individuals and so on. You all know that if you pay any attention at all to the news, right? On the other hand, you have a country like, say, Great Britain or Sweden or even Japan, where you have a monarch, but it's what we call a constitutional monarch, and where they may still, for example, in Great Britain, just rhetorically refer to the Queen as the sovereign, but the Queen really is not the sovereign. The ultimate political authority in Great Britain, just like in the United States, is the people through their elected representatives in the House of Commons. Okay? So we can make those kinds of distinctions as we go along. Okay? We'll have some time, I think, to do that. Okay? So we've got some ideas that are relatively short-lived. We've got some ideas that are longer-lived. We have some ideas that are motivated principally by economic interests. And I have up there as an example, labor laws. But that's certainly not the only example that we could come up with. I think, for example, the arguments that people make, the ideas that people have about tax policy. Some people advocate progressive income taxation. Some people advocate a flat tax concept. Some people advocate a national sales tax, like getting rid of the federal income tax altogether and having a national sales tax. Right? So we have all these ideas circulating out there about policy, tax policy, And for about the last 100 years, the predominant idea has been a progressive income tax concept. How do I know that? How do I know that for the last 100 years, the predominant idea with respect to tax policy at the national level has been a progressive income tax, rather than, say, a flat tax, or what economists call a head tax, or ad valorem taxation, or some other set of, national sales tax or something like that? How do I know that? Well, because we have a progressive income tax. We're in tax season now, and many of you are going to be filing your W-4 form here in the next few weeks or whatever, and you know that you're, what's the basic concept behind a progressive tax? We don't have to get into all the details of what's involved in the federal tax code, but what's the basic idea behind a progressive income tax? The more you make, the more you pay. Okay? So that's an idea that came to prominence about 100 years ago, that we're going to have a tax system in this country where, broadly speaking, the more you make, the more you pay. And it's had all kinds of modifications over the years, changes and so on, but that's still basically the idea that is predominant. Okay? Sometimes ideas are advanced principally on moral grounds. I think a very obvious example of that in the 19th century was the abolitionist movement, those who were advocating the end of slavery as an institution, the ownership of human beings as chattel. Clearly, there's a moral imperative behind that argument. Oftentimes, though, ideas that are really motivated by economic interests are couched in moral language. I think for a good chunk of the last 60 or 70 years in this country, maybe even longer, the debate over what most people call welfare policy has worked like that to a very large extent, particularly people who want to restrict welfare benefits, people who want to place severe limitations on those who are eligible for welfare benefits, have a tendency to make their arguments in moral language. They'll say things like, the reason we want to limit welfare benefits and not let people have welfare benefits for too long is because they'll become dependent upon them, and that deprives them of the dignity of hard work and self-reliance. And I'm not suggesting to you that that's not a genuinely believed argument, but I think we have the ability in the political arena to oftentimes couch our true motivations in those kinds of terms. I think for many people it may just be that they don't like the idea of their tax money going to pay for people who don't support themselves. It's really kind of motivated largely by economic self-interest. So I guess the point I'm trying to make to you is that the politics of ideas can take many different forms, okay? But broadly speaking, what we have out there are all these ideas that are in competition with one another, and there's a connection between those ideas when they come to prominence and what government actually does as a matter of policy agenda. Okay, now having said that, I want to talk a little bit very broadly about ideas and how they inform the creation of the American political system, how it was structured, and how it operates really to this day. Right? So we're going to talk a little bit about some basic ideological assumptions. And I want to begin by suggesting to you what the assumptions are of a particular ideology known as liberalism. Okay? Actually, before you get too busy writing, I know that this can get frustrating. Let me take this off just so that you don't get distracted. Right? I should have done this first. Right? We're going to talk here for the next little bit about the role of ideology. Ideologies are systems of political thought, or systems of ideas. And any ideology, whether it is liberalism, what I call classical liberalism, or classical conservatism, or communism, or fascism, or any other ism, right? That suffix ism, when you see it on the end of a word, often denotes a system of thought. We're particularly interested here in systems of political thought, but it is also true in other areas of thought, like, say, economics, capitalism, mercantilism, socialism, corporatism, right? In areas of sort of social thought, like, say, feminism, or in areas of religious thought, like Catholicism or Judaism, right? So anytime you see that, not always, but oftentimes when you see that suffix ism on the end of a word, it's indicating a system of thought. As I say, we're mainly interested in this class in systems of political thought, but from time to time we deal with some of the others as well. Okay? So any ideology, an ideology, an ism, is a system of thought that ultimately comes down to two considerations, right, about the purposes and scope of government. Why do we have government? Every ideology essentially poses that question. Why do we have government? And secondly, how much authority should government have to fulfill that purpose? Okay? So, classical liberalism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. Classical conservatism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. By the way, those terms, liberal, just a little bit of forewarning here. Those two terms, liberalism and conservatism, are tossed around a lot in American politics today. I am using the terms, I keep putting that word classical in front of them because I'm trying to indicate to you that I'm using these terms from this point for the next little while anyway, in a way that's not commonly used in the popular political debate discourse. Right? In fact, the way that the media people use those terms, and people who are politicians themselves or political pundits that you might bloggers and so on, the way that they use those terms, liberal and conservative, in American politics, they have become largely meaningless, I think. Right? So classical liberalism reaches some conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have. Classical conservatism, communism, fascism, all of these systems, anarchism, all of these systems of political thought ultimately come down to that. But before any of them can reach any conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have, they make some preliminary assumptions about human beings and society. Right? Specifically with respect to human beings, they make some assumptions about human nature. Why do human beings behave in the way that they do? What motivates them? About society, what are the social arrangements in any given society like? Is there a class system? There are all sorts of questions that are posed that have to be dealt with before the ideology can actually address the question about why we have government, how much authority government should have. So I want to just sort of run through with you a couple of alternatives here. Okay, starting with classical liberalism. And I'm going to argue that classical liberalism is really the dominant ideology in American political life. Classical liberalism historically has been the dominant ideology in American political life. I think that's true at least through our national history, going back to the founding of the Republic in 1776. But a strong argument can be made going back into the colonial period as well. Classical liberalism is the dominant system of political thought. It's the dominant ideology. And again, if you're thinking to yourself, hold on, Fagin, how dare you? I'm a conservative. How dare you? I know better. Most Americans are conservative. I'm not using the term liberal like you think, or like the media people use it, or the pundits use it, or the politicians use it. Liberalism as a system of political thought, as an ideology, has been the ideology that advances the rights and liberties of individuals. Notice the common root between the word liberty and liberal. And what could be more American than the concept of liberty? It's the founding principle. You know that, to my knowledge, I'm certainly no historian, but I think I'm on the right track here. The United States of America, when it was founded in 1776, was the first nation founded on the basis of an idea. You think about human history. Nations have usually been founded either on the basis of a common race or ethnicity or a common language. The Americans come along in 1776 and form a nation on the basis of an idea. That idea is liberty. It is the founding principle. And to a large extent, over the last 200 plus years, most Americans have accepted that as the organizing principle of our society, regardless of race or ethnicity, regardless of national origin, regardless of income level, regardless of level of educational achievement, regardless of religious background, regardless of any of the demographic factors that you might want to throw out there. The United States, American society is certainly a diverse society. I mean, it is the essence of pluralism, right? Diversity. That Latin phrase, e pluribus unum, what does that mean? Who knows what that means? From many one, e pluribus unum, from many, what? What was that? Well, thank you, I appreciate that. E pluribus unum, from many one, is the suggestion that American society, we have lots of differences. There are so many differences among Americans, as I say, any way you want to slice it up, but we're one people. On what basis are we one people? Oh, this concept of liberty. Okay. What could be more American? As immortal words of Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. So, when I use the term liberal here in this discussion, I want you to understand that that's the system of thought I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a Hillary Clinton liberal or a Bernie Sanders liberal or something like that. In fact, all of that on both sides of the political aisle, so to speak, liberal, as we call liberals and conservatives in American politics, really sort of accept that basic organizing concept of American society. Okay, so what are the assumptions that liberalism makes about human beings? Liberals assume that human beings are rational, self-interested, and acquisitive. What do we mean by rational? What do you think liberalism contemplates when it says that human beings are rational? It does sort of suggest that there's an ability there of the human animal to reason things out. That's pretty good. That's a good start. Anything else?
Common sense.
Maybe. Maybe not. Could. Perhaps.
A majority of people won't act like, for lack of a better word, crazy. Like, out of the blue. They'll have a thought process behind what they're doing.
There may be some implication of that. I think that's not. I think there's some aspect of that there's an implication that most people are going to be, thoughtful and not act on impulse, if that's kind of what you mean by that. But certainly not. That's not the essence of what we mean by rational. Rational is one of those terms in the English language that means different things depending on who's using it in the context. For example, rational in this context that we're talking about means something very different than what a mathematician means by rational. Right? We're opting for really an economic understanding of the concept of rational behavior. Have any of you taken an economics course? Right? Those of you who've taken an economics course have some sense of what economists mean by rational? There's a lot. It actually has, quite a bit of things that, aspects that we could talk about. But I think one thing that it clearly means is that when individuals are faced with making decisions, they choose the alternative. There's more, two or more alternatives out there that they have to choose from. They choose the alternative that they believe will bring them the most net benefit. That's what rational means to an economist. Right? That human beings are rational. Their behavior is rational when they make decisions based on a cost-benefit calculus. An economist will tell you that every decision you make, day-to-day decisions, very sort of mundane decisions to very big decisions, are essentially a cost-benefit calculus. When you're trying to decide whether or not to get up to come to Fagan's government class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the midday, or maybe stay home and watch some stream some videos on Netflix or something like that, you have to make a decision. You have a couple of alternatives there, and you do a cost-benefit calculus. If you calculate, and oftentimes that cost-benefit calculus, sometimes, occasionally, people will actually sit down and sort of lay out all the costs and benefits associated with each alternative, but oftentimes it's done on a snap. Right? Which is not the same thing as saying that they're doing it on impulse. Right? But sometimes it's just done like that. Right? If you calculate that you will get more benefit out of staying home and lounging around on the sofa and streaming whatever your favorite show is on Netflix versus the benefits that you would get, the net benefits that you would get from coming to Fagan's government class, it would be irrational for you to show up to Fagan's government class. Doesn't that make sense? If you consider buying a soft drink out of the vending machine and you calculate that you're going to get $1.75, or you're going to get $2 worth of benefit of drinking the soft drink, okay, and the price of the soft drink is $1.75, it's rational to do what? To buy the soft drink, right? If you all calculate, however, that you're only going to get $1 worth of benefit and the price is $1.75, it would be irrational to put $1.75 in the machine and buy the soft drink, right? So whether or not we're aware of it, we're doing a cost-benefit calculus. When you decide what you're going to go have for lunch, oh, I can go to, Torchy's Tacos, have a taco. I can go to the mall, food court. I can go to, whatever your options are out there. You have so many options out there. How many, let's say you're considering 5 different options. And you decide in the final analysis that you want to go to Subway and have a sandwich, but somehow your car ends up at Torchy's Tacos, and you're sitting at Torchy's Tacos eating tacos, then what does that tell us? What does that tell us about, you may say to yourself, oh, I really want a Subway today, but it's your behavior that tells you what the rational decision was, right? Okay, so the first thing that liberals assume about human nature is that human beings are rational. And that's a very, very important assumption that the founders of our political system make when they create the system of government in the late 18th century. Okay, we continued our discussion last time of the politics of ideas, and we had gotten into some discussion of an ideology as a more or less consistent set of beliefs about the purposes or scope of government. You'll remember that I told you that any ideology, whatever the ism is, whether it's liberalism or conservatism or anarchism or communism, whatever that specific system of political thought is, ultimately makes some judgments or reaches some conclusions conclusions about why we have government and how much authority government should have, but you can't just jump right to that. No ideology just jumps right to those considerations. There have to be some initial intellectual groundwork done concerning a couple of very basic things. Human nature. What are human beings all about? Why do human beings behave the way they do? What motivates them to behave in the way they do? Social life and social relationships. What is the nature of the relationships among the members of society? What are the obligations of society or of the individual to society? What are the obligations of society to the individual? Is there a class system, right? Or is it a community of equals, right? Some fairly important basic assumptions that have to be made before ultimately they can get to this question about why we have government and how much authority government should have. So I was really beginning the process last time of working through that with you, and I suggested to you that we're going to talk about classical liberalism as being the dominant system of political thought in American political life, really through the national period. By that I mean going back to the founding of the Republic in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. But I think an argument can be made even going back into the colonial period as well. What kinds of assumptions did the American founders make about human nature? Because those are really what inform the political system that they established, particularly when they wrote the Constitution in 1787. I mean, we see very clearly in the kinds of political institutions and political processes, governmental institutions and processes that they embraced, some very clear assumptions that they made about human nature, social life, and social relationships, etc. That's why I'm trying to invest a little bit of time to try to go through this with you. Now, we can talk about these as being assumptions of the American founders, but more broadly, these are assumptions of liberal political thought. And remember, I told you that we're using the term liberal in this discussion, and really from this point forward, as we talk about this, we're using that term liberal in the classical usage, not in the contemporary political discourse where people talk about liberals versus conservatives. And if you think about yourself as a conservative, that's fine. But just understand that, for conservatives today, they just cringe when they think about liberals, right? It's just the worst people on the face of the earth, whoever they think those liberals are. Liberals don't think of themselves that way. Maybe they think of conservatives that way. But we're not using the term liberal. Or, as a matter of fact, when we use the word conservative here in a few minutes, we're not using the word conservative in that very distorted context that it's used in American politics today. We're using the term liberal here to denote a system of political thought that asserts the rights and liberties of individuals. And I invited you last time to just keep reminding yourself, if you don't believe that, just keep reminding yourself of the common root between the words liberal and liberty. Right? Liberalism is a system of political thought that asserts the liberties of the individual. Nothing could be more American than that. We also said last time that that's really the one thing that sort of is the glue. The authors of your textbook, I think, kind of make this point as well. They make not exactly in the same way, but they do make the point that the one thing that seems to bind Americans together is common or core political values. Chiefly among these is the value of liberty. That Americans, regardless of their national origins or their race or ethnicity, or income level or educational achievement or religious background, all the diversity of American life notwithstanding, most Americans, there are exceptions, but most Americans have sort of accepted, bought into the liberal value system. Thomas Jefferson, back in 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Well, you know what? If they're self-evident truths, you just accept them and move on. You don't sit around debating them. You don't get that kind of debate. We don't get that kind of fundamental ideological debate in American political life like you do in other societies which are actually racially and ethnically and linguistically and so on more homogeneous than the United States. Many European countries, for example, have had that sort of fundamental ideological debate. Why, for example, has communism never competed for the hearts and minds of Americans? We have just sort of rejected it out of hand. Whereas in European countries, like say maybe Italy or Germany or whatever pick your favorite European country, you have had a credible communist alternative, right? Or fascism, or anarchism, or any of these other systems of political thought, of ideology that we'll talk just a little bit about here in a second. Right? Americans have just sort of rejected those, and I think that goes back to the very founding. And I think those words that Jefferson wrote are very powerful and have a lot of meaning for us even today when he says that there's self-evident truths. As I say, there's self-evident truths. You don't sit around and debate them. You just move on. Have you ever heard as divided as we all think that American political life is today, Democrats versus Republicans, liberals versus conservatives, etc., you hear the media people talk and the pundits talk, you can't get farther apart than a Democrat and Republican in the early part of the 21st century. But have you ever heard anybody involved in the political debate today, whether you want to call them a liberal or conservative or something else, who trashes the Declaration of Independence? Have you ever heard anybody out there say, have you ever read the Declaration of Independence? Have you seen the nonsense that's in that thing? Of course not. How could anything be more wonderful, right? The Constitution, have you ever read the Constitution? What a bunch of garbage that is. Liberal or conservative, we don't debate the wisdom of the Constitution or its framers. We may debate whether or not what we're doing today is consistent with the wisdom of the Constitution and its framers, but we kind of accept it as for many Americans, you got the Bible and you got the Constitution. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was saying that I've heard the argument about how when the Constitution was written, that was a different era and the different that's the only argument I've heard about trashing the Constitution. Those guys were riding around on horseback, they don't think it's different from today.
Well, sure. I mean, there's lots of differences between then and now. One of the differences is, how about this? Just to kind of hammer my point home, and then we'll break some new ground. One of the differences between now and then, I just said a moment ago, is that virtually no one in American political life today trashes the Constitution. I don't hear anybody out there saying, we really ought to trash the Constitution and come up with something new. Right? But did you know back then, at the time that the Constitution was written and being in the process of being ratified, there was serious opposition to the ratification of the Constitution. Apparently, the wisdom of the Constitution and its framers was not so conspicuously obvious to the opponents of the ratification of the Constitution. There was some question, I don't want to jump too far ahead of the game, but there was some question at the time whether or not the Constitution could actually be ratified. And the ratification of the Constitution only came about as a result of a political compromise, which we'll get to. But that's one difference between then and now, is that we just kind of accept it as gospel today, almost, right? But back then, there was no such clear or conspicuous sense that the Constitution was this wonderful document that was going to order our lives and make things wonderful and, so on. All right, so we had started this process last time, as I remember, talking about the assumptions of liberalism with respect to human nature. We said that human beings are rational. We got into some discussion of what liberals understand rational behavior to mean. And as I told you last time, it has lots of implications, but I think the main thing for our purposes is to say that it suggests that human beings have the ability, when faced with alternatives, to choose the alternative that they believe will bring them the most net benefit. It involves a cost-benefit calculation. We have some sense of what the costs and benefits are of each alternative in front of us. And we do some sort of calculation. Oftentimes it's almost instantaneous, but we do some sort of calculation about which alternative will bring us the most net benefit. Okay? And that is indicated by our behavior. The example I was trying to use, even on very routine or mundane kinds of decisions that we make, like where are we going to go for lunch, right? We think of all our alternatives, and if we show up at Chewy's down there and have the enchilada plate, then that must mean in our calculation of all the costs and benefits that are associated with all the alternatives out there, I believe that I'm going to get the most net benefit out of going to Chewy's and having the enchilada plate. That must be what that means, right? Now, one of the things that you probably, or I hope, are beginning to appreciate from that discussion is that there's no objective standard for what is rational. That's an important point here. You should not make the mistake of assuming that rational here means smart, because even dumb people behave rationally most of the time. I'm not a psychologist by training. I don't have that in my background, so I could be wrong about this. But as far as I can tell, most human behavior can be described as rational. I think there might be some psychotic conditions that cause people to behave irrationally, but most human behavior can be described as rational in that, whether it's objectively speaking good or bad behavior, even criminal activity is rational behavior. Our whole criminal justice system is really premised on the idea that human beings are rational. Why else punishment? What is the idea of a system of punishments in the criminal justice system based on? It's based on the presumption that potential criminals will do a cost-benefit calculus. And if you can ratchet up that punishment enough, and if you can ratchet up the probability that you're going to be apprehended and caught and prosecuted and punished for your criminal behavior, that you'll make the decision that it's not worth it, that the costs outweigh the benefits. Now, obviously, people who engage in criminal activity make the cost-benefit calculus that they can either get away with it and not get caught, or if they do get caught, the punishment's going to be enough to bear. Right? The whole thing's based on the presumption that people are rational. We do have provisions in our criminal justice system to accommodate criminal activities that are committed by people who are behaving irrationally or psychotically, right? But you understand what I'm saying. On the whole, it's based on the premise that people are rational. So it's not an objective standard. You know, one of the examples that I mentioned to you last time was your decision that you make every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, whether or not to come to this class. And your alternatives, let's just keep it simple, are two. Come to class and listen to Fagin, talk about liberal assumptions about human nature, society, and government, or stay home and stream Netflix, right? And if your cost-benefit calculus is that you get more net benefit out of staying home and streaming Netflix, then it would be irrational for you to come to class. Now, sometimes the cost-benefit calculus changes later on. For example, just to extend that, we get down to early May, and you look at your course grade, and you sort of say to yourself, oh, maybe I didn't have a full understanding of the costs and benefits of not going to Fagan's government class. All that kind of changes, right, that cost-benefit calculus. But as it doesn't change the fact that when you made the decision, you made the decision to stay home and stream Netflix because you thought you were getting more net benefit out of that. So that's what we mean by rational here. So, and you can kind of ask yourself as we go through this process, are human beings like that? Do human beings behave in that way? Some of you may say yes, some of you may say no. We'll continue though. Self-interested, is that straightforward enough? Egoistic, looking out for number one, is that true? It doesn't preclude, by the way, liberals I think would say that it doesn't preclude the possibility, the fact that human beings are egoistic, self-interested, it doesn't preclude the possibility that they are charitable also, or altruistic. How else do you explain somebody helping out total strangers when you have a flood and they get in their boats and they come and rescue people? How is that self-interested? Interesting question, right? It's certainly charitable. It's certainly a wonderful manifestation of human charity, right? I think some economists might say, for example, most economists, free market economists, would agree that human behavior is rational, right? So I think most economists would say, yeah, it is charitable, but that person who's getting in that boat and driving around helping, they also get something out of that, right? They get a sense of satisfaction that is hard to monetize, maybe, but they still get something out of that, and they're calculating a benefit that outweighs whatever cost they incur in terms of gas in their boat and risk and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Acquisitive. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Human beings are acquisitive. about what that means?
Say inquisitive.
Acquisitive.
Acquisitive.
Yeah, those are two different words. Inquisitive versus acquisitive. Inquisitive means that we ask a lot of questions,
Yeah,
right?
well, that's
Inquiring
what
minds, right? Acquisitive means we like to acquire things, right? And I think in the classical liberal tradition, that would be a largely material manifestation. We like to acquire material things. Perhaps it wouldn't necessarily have to be, right? But for most of us, it's going to be that material aspect. We want the nice home, we want the nice car, we want the second home of the lake or the beach, we want, all these, gadgets, and maybe as a measure of our own success, perhaps. Maybe just for comfort, but, we do like to acquire things. That seems to be a basic pattern of human behavior. And by the way, it is also these assumptions that we're talking about here so far with liberalism are also assumptions of a system of economic thought called capitalism. Capitalism really makes the same sort of assumptions about human nature, society, and government as liberalism does. In fact, it is interesting to note that historically liberalism emerges as a system of political thought, and capitalism emerges as a system of economic thought out of liberal political thought. So, for example, in the 18th century, and we'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit, the liberal political philosophers are laying the groundwork, and the capitalist economists are come along during that period, later in that period as well, and sort of apply the liberal political principles to economics. We're according to liberalism and capitalism, we are acquisitive by nature. As I say, it doesn't necessarily have to be material in nature, but it seems like mainly. What would be something that a person might be interested in acquiring that's non-material? Oh, here's an example. I knew a guy when I was in graduate school, and have not maintained real close contacts with him in the years since, but occasionally. Last time I talked to him, which was probably about 10 years ago, he informed me that after graduate school, he got his graduate degree in political sciences. I did. He went on to get a law degree, and then after that, he was at the time I spoke to him, he was in medical school, and I thought. Appeared that he had just spent his entire adult life in school acquiring knowledge. Maybe that's the way he defines his self-worth, is in terms of how much formal knowledge he can acquire. Right? So it wouldn't have to be material. It didn't seem to be for him, but it sure seemed to be acquisitive behavior. Human beings are naturally competitive. What about that? Liberals assume that human beings are naturally competitive. It's hard to imagine too many areas of American life that are not premised on competition. Our economy is premised on competition. The workplace is premised on competition. Okay? Competition for the job to begin with, competition for the promotion, competition for salary increases, to some extent, historically anyway. Moving away from this somewhat, but historically, higher education has been premised on competition. Obviously, athletics. How about this? Can you imagine? We're about to have a Super Bowl, right? Can you imagine Super Bowl night comes? Unfortunately, you have to work, right? And your boss is like Fagin. He won't let you have your electronic device on, monitoring the game while you're on work. So you have to wait until work is over. And the first thing that you do is, when your shift is over, the game's been over for a few hours now, you power up your phone and you have a text message from your best friend that says, "Oh, it was a great game. Did you see the game?" "No, I was at work. Who won?" "What do you mean, who won?" "Who won the game? Was it the Patriots or was it the Patriots?" Nobody won. What are you talking about? Nobody won. Come on, quit fooling around. Who won? Nobody won. What was the score? There was no score. It was just a demonstration. demonstration of athletic abilities. You wouldn't know what to do with yourself for the next year, not knowing who the Super Bowl champion was. Okay? So, obviously, athletics, other aspects of American life. It's not unique to American life, of course, but I'm saying it certainly is an integral part of American life. And notice that second part there. It says, most productive in a society that values personal achievement to produce incentive. The competition is oriented around the idea that the reason that you work hard and compete and become more productive is because you are allowed to, for the most part, keep the rewards of your efforts. Right? That's the concept of personal achievement. Is that part of America, the sort of American life? Well, that's certainly what liberals assume about human nature. We could have probably predicted, take it from an old guy, right, who grew up during the Cold War. When I took the very class that you're taking right now, I had to take it too. All those years ago, it might not have been numbered Government 2305, it was the introductory American government course, right? There was not a political science professor in this country that would have walked into a classroom and said, by the end of this decade, we will be talking about the collapse of European communism. Because in those days, in that bimodal superpower ratio, there were two great superpowers in the world: the United States and its Western allies, and the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc. Okay? And no one saw it coming 8, 9, 10 years earlier. Okay? But by the end of the 1980s, certainly by the beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. European communism had collapsed. So I used to think about this kind of stuff a lot. As the years have gone by, I think about it less, but I used to think a lot about how much time and energy and worry we could have saved ourselves during that Cold War period if we had just recognized that communism was not a credible threat to the American way of life. The Soviet economy was never really a serious competitor to the American economy. The values of communism never seriously competed for the hearts and minds of Americans, as I said a few minutes ago. All the national treasure and energy and worry that we put in. I mean, look, I'm a realist. Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, did say, "We will bury you." So we had reason to worry. I'm old enough to remember the exercises in elementary school where the alarm bell would go off and we would be marched out into the hallways and told to get down on our hands and knees and tuck our heads between our knees in preparation for the day when the nuclear bombs would rain on our heads. We knew we were going to die if that happened, but we were going to do it in an orderly fashion. You all didn't have that experience. Well, we were worried. Right? This was a real threat to our way of life. I'm just saying that in hindsight, we probably should have had more confidence in our own value system, that it would eventually prevail. And what is it that's wrong-headed about communist ideology? Well, I think ultimately what liberals would say is that it makes incorrect assumptions about human nature. What incentive does the worker on a collective farm have to work hard and produce and make a good product? Or in the collective factory, if they're not allowed to reap the rewards of their hard work? That's why liberalism assumes that human beings are most productive in a society that values personal achievement. Work hard, produce better and more, and you're going to reap the benefits of that. Human beings are imbued with nature, by nature, with certain rights. That's pretty American, right? Jefferson tells us in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And we'll have an opportunity to talk much more about that idea. So if these are the kinds of assumptions that liberalism makes about human nature, then when it gets to the business about social life and social relationships, it's likely to make these kinds of conclusions, or these kinds of assumptions. Ways must be found to harness the rational self-interestedness and competitiveness of human nature so that the general good may be produced. Liberalism, we've said, is the ideology that asserts the rights and liberties of individuals, but it does have a concept of the general good. And that concept is basically this. Liberals have historically sort of advocated the idea that individuals are the best judge of their own self-interest. Nobody knows better than you what's good for you. Think about that for a second. The assumption of rational behavior is really premised on that belief, that nobody knows better than you do what's good for you, particularly not government. So if you are allowed a degree of freedom that is practically, the maximum degree of freedom that's practically possible, under those circumstances you are most likely to achieve whatever objectives it is that you have defined for yourself. And when, what is your first name? Eduardo. When Eduardo achieves his objectives because he's free to pursue his interests, and when Shadia achieves hers, and when Thomas achieves his, and Andrew achieves his, right? And all of the rest of us, when we achieve our objectives, the general good is produced as the sum total of all that individual success. I think that's the simplest way to think about the way liberals view human progress, societal progress. Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, captures that idea pretty succinctly in the expression pursuit of happiness. I wonder why Jefferson used that language in the Declaration of Independence. He says, all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which had been universally understood from John Locke, the British philosopher, to be life, liberty, and the state. And for some reason, Jefferson, maybe he's just being poetic, bless you. Jefferson did have the reputation of being a wordsmith, of being very good with words, right? So maybe he's just being poetic. For a century, going back to John Locke, the concept of life, liberty, and estate, or life, liberty, and property, have been the understanding, right? Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence moves estate or property to the pursuit of happiness. But they all understood what he was talking about. The idea that individuals should be free to pursue their own rational self-interest. And when they're free to do that, they're most likely to be successful. And when individuals are successful, society as a whole moves forward. By the way, that is exactly the same assumption that the economist Adam Smith made in his classic treatise on economy. And the father of capitalist economic theory, Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, is arguing for an economy premised on individual initiative, where individuals decide, not government, what economic objectives to pursue. The basic premise of capitalism. So the general good then consists of a balance of private and public ends. So once those assumptions are made about human nature and the assumptions about social life and social relationships are made, then you can get, your ideology can get to the business about the purposes and scope of government. So liberalism assumes that government's purpose is to provide a healthy environment to maximize individual opportunity and protect rights. That is really the essence of liberalism's assumption about the purposes of government. I keep referring to Thomas Jefferson. You may pick up on the fact as we go through the semester that I put Jefferson pretty high up on the list of Americans who have made contributions to our society. In my mind, he's like in the top 3. Okay? Lots of aspects of Jefferson that we don't have time to go into, but if we could ask Mr. Jefferson, dig him up, go to Monticello, dig him up, bring him in. Mr. Jefferson, why do we have government? Seems like a reasonable question, and a reasonable person to ask that question, right? Mr. Jefferson, why do we have government? I'm convinced that he would shrug his shoulders, he would bow his head, maybe wag his head. You haven't read my declaration, have you? Did you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote his own epitaph on his tombstone? Have any of you ever been to Monticello? Seen Jefferson's gravestone? You ought to make a pilgrimage. Okay? At some point when you're in that part of the country, in Virginia, make a trip to Monticello. Look at Jefferson's gravestone as well as the house. You know, he was an architect. He designed his own house and all that sort of stuff. He identified 3 things as his greatest contributions that he wanted on his tombstone. Author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Statutes for Religious Freedom of Virginia, and father of the University of Virginia. Nothing in there, nothing on that tombstone about his presidency, nothing there about the Louisiana Purchase or anything like that, right? I think he would be so disappointed given his belief that the Declaration of Independence was one of his great contributions. You haven't read my declaration. If you had just read it, you would not be asking me that question. Because he tells us very succinctly and with no equivocation whatsoever why we have government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Why do we have government, Mr. Jefferson? To secure the rights of individuals. He tells us very clearly why we have government. That is the most succinct expression of liberal political thought with respect to the purposes of government that I can possibly offer you through the pen of Thomas Jefferson. It's not an idea that's original to Jefferson, don't misunderstand me. Okay? But it's the most succinct little blurb I could possibly point you to that really captures the way that liberals understand the purpose of government. In the modern applications of liberal political thought, for example, we go through, let's see, you have founding in 1776, you go through the 19th century, get into the 20th century. By the time you get to the turn of the 20th century, through the 20th century and now into the early part of the 21st century, there is a strand of liberalism that even goes a little bit beyond that. This strand of liberalism doesn't just see government's purpose as securing the rights of individuals, but also maximizing opportunities for individuals. And if you think about to a large extent what happens in American political life today, particularly during election campaigns, next time we have a presidential election campaign, not that far down the road, you and I won't be meeting at that time, but maybe you'll remember we had this little discussion here. Listen to what the candidates are saying. And think about how much of what they're talking about is really being framed in terms of why my plan, why my platform is so much better at enhancing opportunities for individuals than my opponents, whether they are self-described liberals or conservatives. It's all about maximizing individuals' opportunities. There's that, in other words, what I'm telling you, even in the early 21st century, there's still that recognition that goes back to the age of enlightenment that societal progress is most likely when individuals have the opportunity and ability to identify their own objectives and pursue their own happiness, as they define it. Now, in the classical liberal tradition, if we go back to the late 18th century and through much of the 19th century, it is true that liberals assumed that government's purpose was to secure the rights of individuals, but there's another part of it there as well that we've got to get into in quite a bit of detail, and that is that government is also perceived as being the principal threat to the rights of individuals. And so you have to take deliberate measures to restrict or restrain, place parameters on the power of government. That's the concept of constitutionalism that we'll get into. Our founders believed that you don't just trust government. You can't. All human experience has shown that you can't just trust government. Government will abuse its authority. So you have to make a government. You have to constitute a government that has arbitrary limitations imposed on it. That's the concept of constitutionalism that we'll get to. All right. Questions about any of that? Here are some of the prominent liberal thinkers of the Age of Enlightenment. Up there in the upper left-hand corner, you have John Locke, the British philosopher who wrote the Second Treatise of Government, which really became sort of the civic Bible, so to speak, for the American founders. You know, some of you may be aware of this. I referred now several times to the Declaration of Independence and the fact that Jefferson authored that document. Some of you may know that significant passages in the Declaration of Independence read almost verbatim from John Locke's Second Treatise of Civil Government. And it's not that Jefferson was plagiarizing or trying to pull something. They all understood that Jefferson was reflecting Locke and paraphrasing Locke to a large extent. But what took Jefferson just a few sentences in the Declaration of Independence to lay out took Locke an entire treatise, an entire volume back in the 1680s. So he's very important for us. Others that are very important are the French philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau. Here's the Scotsman Adam Smith, the economist down here. Throw in a couple of American, or at least Jefferson the American, the British philosopher John Stuart Mill, the French philosopher Diderot. These are really the important, there are others certainly, but these are really the important thinkers that have some pretty clear impact on the thinking of the American founders. All right, let's give you some something to play liberalism off of, just to sort of drive the point home. So let's go to one end of the scale continuum and talk a little bit about how anarchists view these things. Right? Anarchism is a system of political thought that advocates anarchy. Okay? Not surprisingly, right? Anarchism advocates anarchy, which is most simply defined. Don't get so busy writing stuff on the screen that you lose the context of the other stuff, okay? So you kind of have to keep an ear to what we're talking about here as well, okay? So anarchism advocates anarchy, which is most simply defined as the condition of having no government and no laws. So when anarchists ask and answer the question, what is the purpose of government? Basically, their answer to that is, there is no purpose of government. How much authority should government have? What is the scope of government's authority? Zero. No government, no laws. Why would anyone, at any time, advocate the condition of having no government and no laws? Well, before I answer that question, let me just convince you that you're not anarchists. I mean, I don't know you all individually, but my guess is most of you are not anarchists. I'm not talking about like pop culture anarchists, like they have body piercings and studs under their skin and dyed hair and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about genuine philosophical anarchists. So, just a quick show of hands. How many, when you left your home or apartment this morning, locked the door behind you? Why? You don't assume that people are naturally good and intelligent and reasonable and mutually concerned about your well-being. You don't believe that they'll respect your rights, including your property rights. Right? You know what? Anarchists make those assumptions. Anarchists assume that human beings are naturally good, intelligent, reasonable, mutually concerned about each other's well-being. These qualities of human nature are evident when people are not encumbered by arbitrary rules. So if we could get an anarchist in here, like a genuine anarchist in here, and I'll give you a few examples of anarchists like I did with the liberals here in just a second, but if we could get somebody like, say, Emma Goldman in here, and say she's deceased, long since deceased, but again, dig her up and bring her in, say, Ms. Goldman, what in the world are you talking about? No government, no laws. Can't you see that we need government, we need laws because of the way that people treat each other? Can't you see that people steal from each other? Can't you see that people assault each other? Can't you see that people kill each other? Can't you see that people will enslave each other? What's wrong with you? I wonder what Emma Goldman or other leading anarchist thinkers might say. Oh, you know what? I hadn't really thought about that. You're right. I better rethink my whole worldview. I don't think she would say that. I don't think any of them would say that if they're true anarchists. Here's what I think they might give you some version, and I'm not an anarchist, so with all apologies, I hope I'm not misrepresenting any anarchists among you, but I think that anarchists are essentially saying something like this. Yeah, people mistreat each other. Yeah, people behave badly. But the reason they mistreat each other and behave badly is because of the presence of hierarchical, paternalistic government restricting their freedom and imposing rules of behavior on them. If you want to see the true goodness, you want to see true human nature, the goodness and reasonableness and mutual concern that people have for each other, get rid of government. You can't break the law if there are no laws to break. But more importantly, you can't see the truly admirable qualities of human nature unless you get rid of all that paternalistic hierarchy. In fact, anarchists say the only reason that we have ever had that in human civilization is to impose a class system, to allow those who have to retain what they have and prevent those who have not from having what they have. That's the anarchist view. The whole reason we have government is to preserve that system of class and privilege. So if you want to see the true community of equals, where true human nature will manifest and all this goodness and wonderfulness will show itself, get rid of government. That's as simple as I think you can make it, what anarchists are arguing. Right? So people, in their true state of nature, human beings do not have to be coerced into behaving in an orderly fashion. Society is composed of a community of equals. In such a society, all persons share in the good life because there is no privilege. And then finally, when we get to the assumptions about the purposes and scope of government, there is no need for coercive government at all. If it exists, it is limited to a very minimal role. And actually, I think a true anarchist would be committed to the principle of no government whatsoever. There, in American life, anarchism, like communism, has just been rejected. Why? Because we have a different set of assumptions about human nature. You all know the name James Madison? What is Madison credited? Like, what's his... Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence. What do we give Madison credit for? He's often referred to as the father of the Constitution, right? Madison, of course, Hamilton and others commented that if men were angels, government would be unnecessary. Have you ever heard that before? Madison's famous observation that if men were angels, government would be unnecessary. You know what he's saying there? He's saying that human beings don't have divine nature, they have human nature. If they were angels, we didn't have to have governments. because they're rational and self-interested and inquisitive by nature and naturally competitive, they don't necessarily respect each other's rights. You have to have government. Okay, we'll pick up with that on Friday. So we were talking in the last class meeting about how different ideologies, different systems of political thought. Remember, we defined an ideology as a more or less consistent set of beliefs about the purposes and scope of government. And, maybe with particular thought, thinking about the emphasis on those words more or less. I think I even italicized them in the definition that I put up there on the screen because I'm trying to draw your attention to the reality that some ideologies are more coherent than others, okay? But more importantly, it's not just random thought. It's not just random ideas about the purposes and scope of government. There are these logical interconnections among these assumptions. And we also spent quite a bit of time in the previous class meeting talking about the fact that whatever ideology it is that we're talking about, liberalism or communism or anarchism or whatever the ism, it's ultimately premised on some assumptions about human nature. So we ran through the assumptions of liberalism about human nature. I'm not going to go back through all of that again, but this should look familiar to you because we talked about it previously. We also said that those assumptions about human nature lead to a second set of assumptions about social life and social relationships, and then you get to the assumptions about the purposes of government and the scope of government's authority. Why do we have government? What are the purposes of government? And how much authority, that's the scope of governmental authority, how much authority should government have to fulfill those purposes or that purpose? Okay? Now, just to keep it as simple as possible, what we've said here is that liberalism, traditionally, classically, liberalism has argued that government's purpose is to secure individuals in their rights by nature. Liberals assume that the laws of nature, Jefferson tells us in the Declaration of Independence that the laws of nature dictate. Okay? Just like there are certain immutable laws of nature governing the physical universe. Right? We don't want to jump ahead because we're going to have some discussion specifically about the Age of Enlightenment, but this period of Western history that gives rise to these liberal ideas is a very fertile intellectual period. It's not only the period of John Locke. The Age of Enlightenment is not only the age of John Locke and Denis Diderot and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some of those others that I showed you last time. It is also the period in which scientists in the natural sciences are making these profound development, we're having these profound development. It's the age of Newton. It's the age of Locke. It's the age of Newton, right? And in a very similar way that Newton laid out these laws of motion that are the result of the natural order of the universe, right? Like the law of gravity, Locke, his contemporary at Oxford, is embracing the idea that the laws of nature also dictate that human beings have certain rights. And the Americans, 80, 90 years later, love that notion. They love that idea. Jefferson and the others just jump all over that. And that's why Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature dictate. Okay? So that's really the core of liberalism, this idea that individuals have certain rights by nature, and it's government's purpose to secure individuals in their rights. But as I told you last time, and we do need to move on, break new ground, liberals of that era also assumed that government was the principal threat to the rights of individuals. It's government's purpose to secure individuals in their rights, but it is also the principal problem. Government is the principal problem. It is, let me just sort of redirect our attention here for a second. It is what I like to refer to as Madison's dilemma. Okay? Madison, like Jefferson and most of the other Americans, made these kinds of assumptions. I refer to it as Madison's dilemma because, of course, Madison is the one who is credited as most succinctly stating this problem when he wrote that if men were angels, government would be unnecessary. Okay? So if we kind of boil that idea down to its basic premises and conclusions, it goes something like this. Okay? Here's the actual quote. I kind of kind of that's a summary notion up there at the top. The actual quote is, "If angels were to govern men," I really wish this was right on farther because, and I apologize like that. Is that any better? Not really, huh? Oh well. You don't need the actual quote. If you want the actual quote, you can go out and Google it, right? If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls of government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place you must oblige it to control itself. That's Madison from Federalist number 51. Okay? So what that argument basically comes down to is this, is a couple of ideas. First of all, it says something about the nature of human beings. He says men are not angels. Human beings are not angels. They don't have divine nature. They have human nature. What does that mean? Oh, they're rational and self-interested and acquisitive by nature. They're naturally competitive. And they may have certain rights by the laws of nature, but that doesn't mean that they respect each other's rights. Okay? That's the basic assumption that the American founders made about human beings. Okay? So, because your rights as an individual are under some threat by the random assaults and injuries of your fellow human beings, they may steal from you, or they may assault you, or they may kill you, worst case scenario, right? We have to have government to protect you against those assaults and injuries of those otherwise rational and self-interested and acquisitive and competitive individuals. Okay? However, in creating a government, we must recognize that government is simply composed of human beings. We tend to think about government as this sort of faceless institution, as this institutional arrangement, but it's just people. And the people who occupy positions of government authority have the same nature as everybody else. They're rational and self-interested and acquisitive by nature. They're naturally competitive. And they don't necessarily respect your rights. Okay? The problem for the ordinary citizen is that whereas Joe Problem on the street represents a potential threat to your life, liberty, and estate, the people who occupy positions of government authority potentially represent a much bigger threat to your life, liberty, and estate because the power of government is potentially concentrated. So the answer for Madison and the other Americans of that era is we have to have a constitution. The answer is constitutionalism. And we're not ready to talk in detail about the notion of constitutionalism. We do a big chunk of this course is about American constitutionalism, but we're not quite there yet. So let's just say for now that what constitutionalism means is a recognition that you have to place arbitrary limits on the power of government. If you are inclined to believe that there should be no limits on the power of government, that government should be able to assume any authority that it so chooses, there's no point in having a constitution. The whole purpose of having a constitution is to impose restraints on the power of government. And that certainly is consistent with what Americans of that era believed to the person across the board. Okay, so all of that, all of these notions that we're talking about, human liberty, rights of individuals, constitutional government, all that kind of stuff is really, those are really the key principles of liberal political thought. The American founders were liberals. We also, in the last class meeting, began talking about some alternatives to liberalism. I think, were making some progress talking about the assumptions of anarchism, right? Anarchism is a system of political thought that emerges really towards the tail end of the 19th century. Liberalism emerges in the 18th century and into the 19th century at the time of the founding of the American nation. But anarchism comes along some decades later. Really its origins, I guess, probably go back as far as the early 19th century, but in any kind of organized sense, anarchist ideas were a little bit later, towards the end of the 19th century. Okay, and since I showed you some prominent liberal thinkers like Locke and Diderot and Rousseau and Jefferson and so on, why not show you a few prominent anarchist thinkers of that era? You have, I think I might have referred to Emma Goldman back in the last class meeting, but here are some others. Lucy Parsons is another key one, Nestor Makhno, Alexander Berkman. Okay, so these are just a few names. I don't anticipate that you'll see questions on an exam that would test you, be designed to test to see if you know that Alexander Berkman was an anarchist. Okay, but just kind of give you some context. Okay, so what were the common assumptions that anarchists made about human nature? Well, they're naturally good, intelligent, reasonable, and mutually concerned about each other's well-being. And these are qualities of human nature that are evident when people are not encumbered by arbitrary rules. So remember we said last time that anarchism is a system of thought that advocates anarchy. Right? Now, I think one bit of evidence that most Americans, past and present, have not been anarchists is the way that we understand sort of the popular association that we have with anarchy. If you're watching the news story, do any of you watch televised newscasts anymore, or is that just to your father's thing, right? You've seen one, right? Whether you watch them daily or not, you've seen a newscast. So you're watching a newscast and you see a report that's being aired, and the reporter is standing on the street corner, and in the background you see buildings on fire, and you see rocks and bricks being hurled, and bottles and Molotov cocktails and so on. And the reporter, ducking, trying to make sure, says, "The streets of the city are in a state of anarchy." Right? He or she is not saying that we have fun. Here's what he or she's not saying. We have finally achieved that state of being that we have longed for. Lo, these many hundreds of thousands of years of human struggle, we have finally achieved the anarchist goal. Right? That's not the way you understand the use of that term anarchy. Most Americans understand it to mean a collapse of order, a complete collapse of order, chaos. Right? That's not the way anarchists understand anarchism. True anarchists don't understand anarchism as a collapse of order. They understand it as the removal of arbitrary limits on human freedom, which means doing away with hierarchically organized paternalistic government. So when anarchists advocate the condition of having no government and no laws, it's because they believe that the presence of hierarchical paternalistic government is an impediment to the true nature of the human being. And you can't observe true human nature unless you get rid of that. I told you last time, I believe I remember telling you last time, that anarchists in fact argued that the only reason that we have ever had government
is to impose a class system.
Thank you. Good. Good memory. All right? So that's the basic notions underlying anarchist political thought. Okay, so questions about anarchism? All right, let's give you one other alternative, sort of the other extreme. Here are some assumptions made by classical organic conservatism. And again, this is not the use of the term conservative like we would use it in the popular political parlance of the early 21st century when we talk about liberals versus conservatives in American politics. Actually, let me just jump ahead and show you some of the key people first. This is a system of thought that actually traces its roots back to the beginnings of Western civilization. Right? Certainly at least to the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, okay, and through the Middle Ages, St. Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, and into the early modern period with Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, and you see the Roman Cicero and Cato the Elder. right? These are the kinds of assumptions that were made going back to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans through the Middle Ages and up to the early modern period. So classical organic conservatism actually has a much deeper history, a much longer history in Western civilization than liberal political thought. Liberal political thought has really only been around for about the last 300 years. Conservative political thought goes back a couple of millennia. So what are the kinds of assumptions that classical organic conservatism commonly makes about human nature? Well, human beings are more emotional than they are rational. They are self-indulgent and incapable of making important decisions about how they will be governed. By their nature, people are driven by the desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's the hedonism principle. They're like sheep. Most people are like sheep. All they care about is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And certainly conservatism assumes that talents and intelligence and talents are not evenly distributed. Now, just because I've listed that here as an assumption of classical organic conservatism doesn't mean that liberals would dispute that intelligence and talents are not evenly distributed. I think liberals recognize that. I think probably most of us today recognize that. Clearly not all people have the same intelligence and talents. But it's the logical extension of that, or kind of the next step that's important as we talk about conservative political thought. So when they get to their assumptions about social life and social relationships, they assume that the irrational hedonistic masses must be guided by the few that have the wisdom and the talent so that the needs of society as a whole can be served. Can you appreciate that this is a perfect defense of aristocratic power and privilege? If you begin by assuming that most people are just sheep and they have to be led, and only a few people have the intelligence and talents necessary to make governing decisions, you can't get to democracy from there. There is no way. It's a dead end. You can't get to democracy. In fact, democracy as we understand it in the modern world is really an extension of liberal assumptions about human nature, that human beings, individuals, are the best judge of their self-interest. But conservatism has a much different view. How will we know who has the talents and intelligence necessary to govern? Oh, by birthright. They'll be born into their station in life. They'll be noble by birth. Consequently, there's going to be a class system. There's necessarily social stratification. What a perfect defense of the feudal and manorial arrangements that dominated Western civilization for so many centuries up until the Age of Enlightenment. When less than 2% of the population was noble by birth, it had all the power and the wealth and controlled and dominated the lives of the 98+% of the population that was peasant. So then finally, when we get to the assumptions, conservatives get to the assumptions about why we have government and how much authority government should have, it goes something like this. Government's responsibility is to forcibly impose order on society in a paternalistic, hierarchical fashion, like parents making rules for their children. The masses are actually happiest in such an arrangement because their survival and well-being are guaranteed by a government vested with such authority. That idea, I think, was probably best and most succinctly expressed by the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes. There you see Hobbes, who wrote a classic in Western political philosophy called The Leviathan. Okay? Who lived in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Hobbes is famous for that line, in a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, he develops that idea, but basically what he means by that is human nature is such that if you can imagine human beings existing in a state of nature where you don't have civilized society, where you don't have government, for example, and it's just sort of every man for himself, or every person for himself or herself, the law of the jungle, so to speak, right? What people are mainly concerned about under those conditions is just surviving. You have to really watch your back. Not only by animal predators get you, but other human predators might get you, right? So if we would like to develop civilization, if we would like some of the finer things that civilization brings, like pursuit of the sciences and the arts and culture, what we have to have is a forcible government to impose order on society. The order doesn't just take care of itself. Okay? So that is the key difference, I think, between conservative political thought as we're talking about it versus liberal political thought as we're talking about in the classical usage of those terms. Right? Again, not in the contemporary sense that we talk about Republicans being conservatives and Democrats being liberals. That's not what we mean here. Okay, questions about any of these conservative ideas? Okay, so let's go back to our definition of an ideology. An ideology is a more or less consistent set of beliefs concerning the purposes and scope of government, why we have government, how much authority government should have. We've said that an ideology is premised on some set of assumptions about human nature, social life and social relationships, and then ultimately the purposes and scope of government. Now we have this concept that we need to define, and I think this is fairly consistent with the definition of political culture that the authors of your textbook provide. It's not verbatim, but I think it's pretty consistent. Right? Political culture is the set of political values, beliefs, and norms found in a political community which flow from the basic ideological assumptions about human nature, society, and government. We can talk about a political community. And in the United States, we have different levels of political community. We have a national political community. We have state, political communities organized at the state level and at the local level. And when you take your Government 2306 course, you'll probably get some discussion of how, for example, the political values that Texans embrace are somewhat different than the political values that people from, say, Vermont embrace. Or New York, right? And you probably have some intuition about that anyway, right? But since this is a course in the American national system, we're going to focus our discussion just on the national political culture. And what I'm trying to tell you through this definition is that Americans, generally speaking, despite all of the diversity of American political life, embrace a core set of values. There's a document that I prepared for you and linked up for you as part of your reading assignment for week 1 and week 2. It's called Inventory of American Political Culture. I hope that you have read that. Treat that as part of the in-class discussion because you could see questions on the first test based on that document. Okay? Among the values, and I'm not going to go through them all here because I prepared that document for you for that purpose, right? But liberty, order, equality, justice, rule of law, localism, republicanism, competitive individualism, private property rights, localism, national unity. There are others, but those are the core values of the American liberal political culture. With particular emphasis if we wanted to make a list of most important, certainly at the top of the list, I think we have to put the value of individual liberty. So one of the things that I like to try to suggest about thinking about liberal political thought, really any ideology, but for our purposes, liberalism is the key system of thought. Think about it as being composed of two levels or two layers of thought. There's a core, fundamental level assumptions. What do these have to do with? Human nature, society, the purposes and scope of government. And in American political life, we don't really debate that. We don't really have political debate at this level. Americans don't really sit around over the dinner table or in cafes or coffee shops debating the fundamental nature of human beings. Have any of you done any traveling anywhere in the world besides the United States? Maybe you can testify to this, I don't know, but certainly it has been my experience in traveling internationally that, for example, you travel through Europe, you might overhear conversations among people your age sitting around in cafes or coffee shops where they do engage in a much more fundamental level of ideological discussion. Some of my European friends are quick to remind me, at least take a shot at me, I think, that the fact that Americans don't really talk about these kinds of things is evidence from their point of view that Americans are not very thoughtful. We're not very reflective people. We just are Pollyanna-ish kind of, and my response to them is, it's not that Americans are stupid or not thoughtful about these things. It's that we don't have to sit around and discuss these things. We sorted it out at the founding. And Jefferson told us in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So if they're self-evident truths, why sit around and debate them and discuss them? I think more importantly for our purposes here, my European friends notwithstanding, for our purposes, what it tells us is that the political debate and the political discourse and discussion that we get in the American system isn't over fundamental assumptions. We do get debate and discussion at this level of political thought, a superficial level, right? Although it's really not a debate over whether these are values or whether they should be treated as values. It's really more of a debate over two things. First of all, if there's a conflict among these values, how do you prioritize them? If we see a conflict between liberty and order, or between equality and liberty, or order and justice, whatever the combinations might be here, and we do, a lot of issues in American political life can be thought of in terms of a conflict among these values. Everything from how much of our resources we're going to devote to national defense and anti-terrorism activities, for example, or maybe more domestically police protection on the one hand versus freedom of speech and freedom of association and right to privacy and all that sort of stuff on the other hand, ultimately comes down to conflict between these, right? So we do get those kinds of debates in American political life. Which gets a priority? Is it more important, for example, to restrict privacy and freedom generally in order to preserve national security? Or is it more important to maximize individual liberty, and as a result you understand that there are going to be some breaches of national security? It's been an ongoing problem. It's not a problem that has just emerged with debate over a wall. We also get debate over how you reconcile the value with the reality. Because with any of these, right, many Americans embrace the value, but when they look around and see what's going on around them, they say, well, that's not what we really have. The value of justice, for example, or equality. Either one of those would be great illustrations. Most Americans embrace the value of equality. Right? Are all people equal? Are they treated the same? Should they be treated the same? Should they have equal opportunities? Pretty universally, Americans will say yes, but if you ask people, do we have true equality of opportunity? Do we have true equal treatment under law, etc., the consensus breaks down real quick. So then the debate becomes, how do you pursue these values as a matter of policy? What do you do as a matter of policy to square the reality of justice with the value of justice? Look, there's really one of two ways that we can approach this. If we have this value of justice up here, we have some concept of justice up here, how justice is supposed to work. We can talk about this narrowly in terms of the criminal justice system, or more broadly about maybe the concept of social justice. Whichever way you mind, whatever you want to focus on, right? Okay? We have this value of justice up here. Maybe with the criminal justice system, part of that is the notion that the law should apply the same to everyone, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of income level, regardless of celebrity status, etc. Right? We have this ideal of how justice is supposed to work, but we look at what actually happens in the criminal justice system and say, well, that's not actually how it works. Okay? So the question then becomes, well, what do you do as a matter of policy in order to reconcile those two? And as I started to say, finish that thought, I think there are two basic approaches. One, if you see that gap, you observe that gap between justice and the ideal of justice and the reality of justice, or the ideal of equality and the reality of equality. One approach would be to kind of throw up our hands and say, well, we have this nice notion of justice here, but the reality, so why don't we just get real and, forget about this naive notion of justice we have. I don't think Americans typically do that. I hope that we haven't gotten to that point in our civil society, that we abandon our ideas. I think it's more likely that we try to find some way to reform justice, the reality of justice, to bring it up to this ideal. Equality is the same thing. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Did he mean, and if we want to be gender non-specific, they're all human beings who are created equal? Did he mean in the late 18th century when he wrote those words that all human beings are treated equally? Of course not, right? I think that a good chunk of American political history can be understood in terms of an effort to close the gap between Jefferson's ideal of equality, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and the reality of equality that we have in our daily lives. And let me just ask you, are we closer to that ideal of equality in 2019 than we were in 1787 when the Constitution went into effect? You say yes. Everybody say no? I think an objective observer would have to say we're closer today than we were then, but might quickly follow that by saying we're still not there and we're not even close to being there. Some might go that far and say, yeah, we got a lot of work. We got a long road to hoe in that respect. I just mentioned that to you because I think that's an illustration of how we have undertaken as a civil society an effort to not water down the value of equality, but to raise the reality of equality to the value. So that's where we get debate in American political life, is over means to the value in. And there's lots of debate over means, and it's important debate. But I think we shouldn't forget in that debate, because the politicians aren't going to help us in this regard. Okay? Politicians are not, they're going to try to convince us that we're really different from one another. It is a more effective political strategy to divide than to unite, regardless of the rhetoric that some of them have. Okay? You can convince your base that those other people over there are different from you and that they are a threat to you. It probably serves your immediate political objectives better on either side. I'm not just talking about one side. I'm talking about both sides, if you can think about it in a dichotomous way. But it ignores the fact that Americans have historically, I think probably still to a large extent today, there's a great deal of continuity in terms of the fundamentals and what we believe as a civil society in terms of basic values. Okay, so again, we've said that an ideology poses two questions about government. What are the purposes of government and how much authority government should have? I've listed here 3 possible purposes of government. We might have to end on this point here because I think the alarm's about to go off, so we can take the quiz. I'll talk until it does. Okay. We could probably spend an entire week or more just listing specific things that government does and put it under this heading of purposes of government. But to try to economize on time a little bit, as well as doing things a little bit better, I think most of those specific things that we would come up with would fit under one of these 3 headings. Okay? So I'm going to leave this up here for a second for you to get caught up if you're taking good notes.